Welcome to the History Uncovered. Everything you think you know about cowboys is a lie. The gunfights, the glory, the romantic image of freedom on the open range. Hollywood sold you a fantasy. But what if I told you the real story is even more incredible? What if the truth about how cowboys actually lived would shock you more than any Western movie ever could? Today, we're tearing down the myths and revealing the brutal, fascinating reality of the Wild West. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. First, the daily grind, cowboys and the brutal reality of trail life. The sun rises over the Texas plains, and a young man barely 18 years old opens his eyes. His body aches from sleeping on hard ground. His clothes are stiff with dried sweat and dust. He has maybe 10 minutes before he needs to be in the saddle, ready to move 2,000 head of cattle another 15 miles north. This is not a hero. This is not a legend. This is a cowboy, and his life is about to be far harder than you can imagine. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. The average cowboy was young, poor, and exhausted. Most were teenagers or men in their early 20s. They worked 16 to 18 hours every single day during cattle drives. Their pay was roughly $30 a month, which sounds like nothing because it was nothing. A skilled carpenter in eastern cities made 3 times that amount for half the work. Cowboys knew they were getting a raw deal, but they had few other options. The day begins before dawn. A cowboy rolls out of his bedroll and pulls on boots that are probably falling apart. Good boots cost half a month's wages, so most men wore theirs until they literally disintegrated. He walks to the chuck wagon where the cook, usually the second highest paid person on the drive, after the trail boss, has coffee ready. This coffee is strong enough to strip paint. It's made from beans that have been roasted, ground, and boiled in water that came from whatever stream or river they passed. Sometimes that water is clean, often it is not. Breakfast is simple and repetitive. Beans, bacon, biscuits, and more coffee. Day after day, week after week, the same meal. Fresh vegetables are impossible to keep on a trail drive. Fresh fruit is a distant memory. Scurvy is a real danger on drives that last months. Cowboys develop a taste for the monotony because they have no choice. The alternative is hunger. And hunger while working 18 hours in the saddle is a special kind of torture. After breakfast, the work begins in earnest. A cowboy's job is to keep the cattle moving and keep them together. This sounds straightforward until you understand what it actually means. 2,000 cattle do not want to move in the same direction. They scatter, they spook, they try to run. Every cowboy has a specific position in the formation. The point riders lead at the front, the swing riders stay at the sides, the flank riders cover the rear flanks, and the drag riders, the lowest in the pecking order, eat dust at the very back. Riding drag is misery incarnate. The dust kicked up by 2,000 hooves creates a choking cloud that hangs in the air. It gets in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your lungs. Drag riders tie bandanas around their faces, but it barely helps. By the end of the day, they are coughing up brown mucus. Their faces are caked with dirt. They look like they've been rolling in dust because essentially they have. New cowboys always start on drag duty. It's a test and a punishment rolled into one. The cattle move at roughly 15 miles per day. This pace seems slow, but it's calculated to keep the animals from losing too much weight. Fat cattle bring better prices at market, so the cowboys push them steadily, not quickly. 15 miles a day for 2 or 3 months means covering between 900 and 1,300 miles total, from Texas to Kansas, from grass to gold, from the breeding ranches to the railroad depots where cattle are loaded onto trains headed east. But here is what the movies never show you: the boredom. For every moment of excitement, there are hours of mind-numbing tedium. A cowboy rides in the same position, watching the same cattle, breathing the same dust, thinking the same thoughts. His backside is raw from the saddle. His legs ache from gripping the horse. His hands are covered in calluses and rope burns. This is not adventure. This is grueling labor that destroys the body slowly and methodically. Then there are the dangers that can kill you in an instant. Stampedes are the nightmare every cowboy fears. Something spooks the herd. A rattlesnake, a thunderclap, a coyote appearing at the wrong moment. Suddenly 2,000 animals are running in blind panic. They will trample anything in their path, including cowboys. Men have been caught in stampedes and found later crushed beyond recognition. The survivors remember those moments forever: the sound of hooves like thunder, the dust rising like fog, the screaming of terrified animals mixing with the shouts of desperate men. River crossings are another deadly challenge. The cattle have to cross rivers to reach Kansas. These rivers can be calm one day and raging torrents the next. Cowboys swim their horses alongside the herd, trying to guide the cattle across. But cattle are poor swimmers when panicked. They pile up on each other. They drown. Cowboys drown too. In 1871, a single river crossing on the Red River claimed the lives of 4 cowboys and hundreds of cattle. The bodies were found miles downstream, broken and bloated. Weather is an enemy that never sleeps. Summer heat on the plains is brutal. Temperatures climb above 100 degrees. There is no shade, no relief. Cowboys wear wide-brimmed hats, not for style, but for survival. Without that hat, a man can die from heat stroke. They drink water from their canteens, but water is rationed. Running out between water sources means suffering or death. Dehydration turns men delirious. They see mirages. They make mistakes. Mistakes on a cattle drive can be fatal. Winter drives are even worse. Yes, some cattle drives happen in winter when ranchers need to move herds before spring. The cold is merciless. Cowboys wear whatever layers they can afford, but most don't own heavy winter coats. They wrap themselves in blankets. They huddle near campfires at night. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Hypothermia kills men who fall asleep too far from the fire. The prairie wind cuts through clothing like a knife, and there is nowhere to hide from it. Injuries are constant and medical care is non-existent. A cowboy breaks his arm when his horse stumbles in a prairie dog hole. The trail boss sets the bone as best he can, but there are no doctors, no hospitals, no pain medication beyond whiskey. The cowboy wraps his arm and keeps working because stopping means losing his job. Infections from cuts and scrapes are common. A barbed wire scratch can turn septic. Blood poisoning can kill a man in days, and there is nothing anyone can do but watch him die. Saddle sores are another hidden agony. Spending 12 to 18 hours in a saddle every day creates raw, bleeding wounds on a rider's rear and inner thighs. These sores become infected easily. Cowboys develop thick calluses over time, but newcomers suffer terribly. Some men can barely walk by the end of a drive. They hobble into town like old men, though they're barely 20 years old. The pain is so intense that some quit after their first drive and never return. The horses deserve mention because they suffer too. A good cow pony is worth its weight in gold. These horses are trained to respond to the slightest pressure, to anticipate the movements of cattle, to work all day without complaint. But they are pushed to their limits. A horse that goes lame is often shot on the spot because there's no way to transport an injured animal. Cowboys develop deep bonds with their horses because their lives literally depend on these animals. When a beloved horse dies, a cowboy grieves genuinely. Now let's talk about what cowboys actually wore, because Hollywood got this spectacularly wrong. Forget the fancy embroidered shirts and perfectly clean bandanas. A working cowboy's outfit was purely functional and usually falling apart. His shirt was made of cotton or wool, whatever he could afford. It was stained with sweat, dirt, and grease. His pants were heavy canvas or denim, reinforced at the knees and seat because the saddle wore through fabric quickly. He wore chaps, leather leggings that protected his legs from brush and rope burns. His boots were high-heeled, not for fashion, but for function. The high heel prevented his foot from sliding through the stirrup. If a cowboy fell off his horse and his foot caught in the stirrup, he could be dragged to death. The pointed toe made it easier to slip the boot into the stirrup quickly. These boots were expensive, so cowboys protected them fiercely. A man might go hungry to save money for a decent pair of boots because bad footwear meant injury or death. The famous 10-gallon hat is mostly myth. Cowboys wore wide-brimmed hats made of felt or straw. The brim provided shade and protection from rain. The crown was high enough to create an air pocket for insulation. Some men shaped their hats in distinctive ways, but this was personal preference, not fashion. A hat was a tool, not an accessory. It held water for the horse, fanned campfires, signaled to other riders, and provided the only shade for miles. Guns are worth discussing because the truth surprises everyone. Most cowboys did not wear gun belts with shiny revolvers. Guns were expensive. A decent revolver cost 2 months' wages. Ammunition was pricey too. Cowboys who owned guns usually kept them in their saddlebags, not on their hips. The gun belt hanging low on the hip is a Hollywood invention. Real cowboys who carried guns wore them high on their belts or in shoulder holsters for practical reasons. The famous quick-draw shootout is pure fantasy. It didn't happen. Or rather, it happened so rarely that when it did, newspapers wrote about it for weeks. Most violence in the West came from ambushes, arguments that escalated to murder or drunken brawls. Men shot each other, certainly, but they did it from close range, usually while drunk, often over insults or gambling debts. The idea of 2 men facing each other in the street at high noon is romantic nonsense. What about the famous cowboy code of honor? Did cowboys live by some unwritten moral law? Sometimes, but not always. Cowboys developed a culture of mutual dependence because survival required it. If you found a man injured on the trail, you helped him. If you came across a ranch, you could ask for food and shelter, and tradition demanded they provide it. Stealing a horse was considered a hanging offense, not because horses were valuable property, but because taking a man's horse in that environment was essentially murdering him. But cowboys were not saints. They fought, they cheated at cards, they visited prostitutes, they got drunk and caused trouble in towns. They were young men, far from home, with money burning holes in their pockets after months of hard work. When a cattle drive reached a town like Abilene or Dodge City, the cowboys exploded into the saloons and brothels like men released from prison. They drank, gambled, fought, and woke up broke. Then they signed on for another drive because they had no money left. The ethnic diversity of cowboys is a truth that Hollywood erased for decades. Roughly 1 in 4 cowboys was black. These were formerly enslaved men who headed west after the Civil War, seeking freedom and opportunity. They faced discrimination, certainly, but the frontier was more integrated than the post-Reconstruction South. Black cowboys worked alongside white cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, and Native American ranch hands. They did the same work for the same low pay. Mexican vaqueros, in fact, invented most of what we think of as cowboy culture. The word cowboy itself comes from the Spanish vaquero, meaning one who works with cows. The lasso, the techniques for breaking horses, the style of saddle, even the wide-brimmed hat, all came from Mexican cattle ranching traditions that predated American settlement. Anglo cowboys learned from vaqueros and then, over time, took credit for innovations that weren't theirs. Native Americans also worked as cowboys, especially on ranches in Indian Territory. The relationship between cowboys and native peoples was complex and often violent, but on individual ranches, Native American men worked cattle just like everyone else. The Wild West was not the white man's domain that popular culture suggests. It was a melting pot where people of different races and backgrounds worked together, fought together, and sometimes died together. Religious faith played a role in cowboy life, though not always the way you'd expect. Many cowboys carried Bibles or prayer books. Some were genuinely devout. Others turned to religion when facing death or danger. Circuit preachers rode from ranch to ranch, holding services in bunkhouses or under the open sky. But cowboys were also superstitious. They believed in lucky charms, bad omens, and folk remedies. They read the weather and animal behavior and the stars. Faith and folklore mixed freely on the frontier. Let's return to the daily routine, because understanding the repetition is key to understanding cowboy life. After the morning's work moving cattle, there's a brief break for the midday meal. More beans, more bacon, maybe some jerky if they're lucky. The food is consumed quickly because there's no time to waste. Then it's back in the saddle. More miles, more dust, more watching the endless horizon while your body screams for rest. Evening brings a different kind of work. When the herd settles for the night, cowboys take turns on night watch. This means riding slowly around the herd in darkness, singing to keep the cattle calm. Yes, cowboys really did sing to cattle. The sound of a human voice soothed the animals. Cowboys sang old folk songs, hymns, made-up verses, anything to create a constant calming noise. It was lonely, eerie work under the stars, and falling asleep on night watch could lead to disaster. The cook at the chuck wagon is the unsung hero of every cattle drive. He wakes before everyone else. He sleeps after everyone else. He prepares 3 meals a day for a crew of 10 to 15 hungry men using limited ingredients and primitive equipment. He serves as medic, barber, sometimes referee for disputes. A good cook makes a drive bearable. A bad cook makes men miserable and sometimes violent. Trail bosses knew that keeping the cook happy was essential to keeping the crew together. Evening campfires were the social heart of cowboy life. After the day's work, After the evening meal, cowboys would gather around the fire to talk, joke, tell stories, play cards, or just stare into the flames. These were young men far from home, most of them lonely, many of them scared, though they'd never admit it. The campfire was where they formed bonds, where they became something more than individual workers. They became a crew, a temporary family bound by shared suffering and common purpose. But make no mistake, this was not a life of freedom. Cowboys were employees, not independent adventurers. They worked for wages, under the orders of a trail boss who answered to a ranch owner who cared only about profits. Cowboys had no control over their working conditions, their pay, or their futures. If they complained, they were fired. If they quit, they had to walk back to Texas or find work in a strange town with no references. They were trapped by economic necessity in a system that exploited their youth and strength. Second, the real West, the diverse faces of the frontier, and the truth about cowboy culture. When the cattle drive finally reaches its destination, when the herd is sold and the cowboys receive their pay, something remarkable happens. These dusty, exhausted young men transform. They wash off months of grime. They buy new clothes, or at least clean ones. They walk into the cattle towns of Kansas with money in their pockets and freedom on their minds. For a few precious days, they are no longer workers. They are customers, pleasure seekers, men determined to forget the hardships they endured. But the towns they enter are nothing like the sanitized versions you see in westerns. Let me paint you a picture of Dodge City in 1876. This is not a quaint frontier settlement with a noble sheriff keeping the peace. This is a raw, violent, profit-driven boomtown that exists for one purpose only: to extract every dollar from cowboys, railroad workers, buffalo hunters, and anyone else passing through. The main street is unpaved mud that turns to choking dust in summer. Buildings are hastily constructed wood frames, many without paint, some without windows. The smell is overwhelming. Horse manure, human waste, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies create a stench that hangs over everything. The saloons are the economic engines of these towns. There are more saloons than any other type of business. They serve cheap whiskey watered down to stretch profits. The gambling tables are often rigged. The women working upstairs in the brothels are there because they have no other options. Many are widows, abandoned wives, or girls who ran away from abusive situations. They endure the cowboys because it's survival, not romance. The reality of prostitution in the Wild West is grim, exploitative, and nothing like the sassy saloon girls of Hollywood fantasy. Cowboys enter these saloons and begin drinking immediately. After months of sobriety on the trail, alcohol hits them hard. They get drunk quickly. They gamble recklessly. A cowboy might earn $30 per month for 3 months of work, collect $90 at the end of the drive, and blow it all in a single weekend. They wake up broke, hungover, and facing the choice of signing on for another cattle drive or trying to find different work. Most sign on again because it's what they know. Violence in these towns is common, but not the choreographed gunfights of legend. Men get into arguments over card games. Someone accuses someone else of cheating. Punches are thrown. Bottles are smashed over heads. Occasionally, someone pulls a gun and shoots another man at close range. The victim dies on a dirty saloon floor, surrounded by strangers who will forget his name by morning. There is no dramatic music, No slow-motion fall, no meaningful last words. Just blood, death, and the business of the saloon continuing around the corpse. Town marshals in places like Dodge City were not heroic lawmen devoted to justice. They were hired, muscle-paid to keep violence from disrupting commerce too badly. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Wild Bill Hickok, these famous names were not noble sheriffs. They were gamblers, saloon owners, sometimes lawmen who enforced rules selectively. Earp worked as a pimp at one point. Hickok shot a man from ambush. These were hard men in a hard time, survivors who used violence when it profited them and avoided it when it didn't. The legal system was rough and immediate. Serious crimes like murder or horse theft often resulted in hanging, sometimes after a trial, sometimes without one. Vigilante justice was common when official law was absent or corrupt. A man accused of stealing cattle might be grabbed by a mob, given a few minutes to speak in his defense, then strung up from the nearest tree. His body would hang there as a warning to others. This was frontier justice, brutal and final. But let's step back from the violence and examine the economic reality that drove the entire cattle industry. Why were cowboys moving cattle from Texas to Kansas in the first place? The answer reveals the business logic behind the cowboy era and explains why it couldn't last. After the Civil War, Texas had millions of cattle and no market. The war had devastated the South. Local demand was minimal, but northern cities were growing explosively. Chicago, New York, Philadelphia all needed beef to feed their expanding populations. The problem was transportation. You couldn't move cattle from Texas to New York by land. The distance was too far, the terrain too varied, but railroads were spreading west. By the late 1860s, railroad lines reached Kansas towns like Abilene and Dodge City. A brilliant and ruthless entrepreneur named Joseph McCoy realized he could buy Texas cattle cheap, drive them to Kansas, and sell them to railroad companies for transport east. The price difference made fortunes possible. A Texas Longhorn might cost $4 in Texas. That same animal could sell for $40 in Kansas. The profit margin was enormous, assuming the cattle survived the drive. This is why ranchers were willing to organize cattle drives despite the costs and risks. This is why they hired cowboys for poverty wages. The whole system was designed to maximize profit for ranch owners while minimizing costs everywhere else. Cowboys were expendable labor, easily replaced if they quit or died. The cattle themselves were remarkable animals. Texas Longhorns were descended from Spanish cattle brought to Mexico centuries earlier. They had evolved to survive in harsh conditions. They could go days without water. They could eat tough prairie grass that would starve domestic breeds. Their horns could span 6 feet from tip to tip, useful for defense against predators. They were lean, tough, and mean-tempered. Handling them required skill and courage, but Longhorns produced less meat than other breeds. As railroads expanded and ranching became more sophisticated, ranchers began importing Hereford and Angus cattle from England. These breeds were heavier, meatier, and more profitable per animal. But they were also more delicate. They couldn't survive long trail drives. This shift in breeding was one of several factors that would eventually end the cowboy era. When ranchers no longer needed to drive cattle to distant railheads, they no longer needed cowboys in such numbers. Now let's talk about the ranches, where cowboys worked when they weren't on drives. Ranch life was different from trail life, but no less demanding. A working ranch in Texas might cover thousands of acres. Cowboys lived in bunkhouses, simple wooden structures with minimal furniture. They slept in rough beds or on the floor. Privacy was non-existent. Personal hygiene was minimal. Bathing was infrequent because water was scarce and heating water was labor-intensive. Ranch work varied by season. Spring meant branding calves. This was brutal, chaotic work. Cowboys would rope calves, drag them to a fire, and hold them down while another cowboy applied a red-hot brand to their hide. The smell of burning hair and flesh filled the air. The calves screamed. It was necessary to mark ownership in an age before paper records, but it was ugly work that left cowboys covered in sweat, soot, and sometimes blood. Summer meant maintaining fences, hunting predators, and moving cattle to better grazing areas. Fence work was tedious and painful. Barbed wire cuts hands even through gloves. Posts had to be sunk in hard ground under brutal sun. Cowboys hated fence work because it was monotonous and felt beneath their skills. But ranchers were fencing more land every year as the open range disappeared. Fences represented the future, and cowboys resented them for it. Fall brought the roundup. Cowboys from neighboring ranches would work together to gather scattered cattle from the open range. They sorted the animals by brand, counted them, and prepared them for market or winter. The roundup was social as well as practical. Cowboys from different ranches competed in roping and riding skills. They shared news and gossip. Temporary friendships formed. Then everyone returned to their own ranches and the isolation of ranch life. Winter was the hardest season on remote ranches. Work slowed but never stopped. Cattle still needed checking. Fences still needed repair. Cowboys endured freezing temperatures in drafty bunkhouses. Some ranches kept full crews through winter. Others laid off most of their cowboys and told them to come back in spring. Laid-off cowboys drifted to towns, taking odd jobs, living in cheap boarding houses, trying to stretch their savings until spring hiring began again. The relationship between cowboys and Native Americans deserves careful examination because it was far more complex than popular culture suggests. By the time the cowboy era began in earnest after the Civil War, the Indian Wars were entering their final, tragic phase. The U.S. government was systematically destroying Native American resistance, confining tribes to reservations and opening their lands to white settlement and cattle ranching. Some cowboys had fought against Native Americans during various conflicts. Some harbored deep prejudices and hatred. But individual relationships varied. Native Americans worked on ranches alongside other cowboys. Some tribes maintained their own cattle herds on reservation lands. Cowboys and native men sometimes developed mutual respect based on shared skills with horses and understanding of the land. But this was always against the backdrop of genocide and dispossession. The buffalo slaughter is central to this story. The great buffalo herds that had sustained plains tribes for centuries were being exterminated deliberately. Buffalo hunters, not cowboys, did most of this killing. They shot buffalo by the thousands, took the hides, and left the meat to rot. The government encouraged this because starving the tribes into submission was official policy. Cowboys witnessed this slaughter. Some participated. The stench of millions of rotting buffalo carcasses hung over the plains for years. As the buffalo disappeared, cattle replaced them. Ranchers moved into territories that native peoples had occupied for generations. This wasn't accident or natural progression. It was policy backed by military force. Cowboys were not the architects of this displacement, but they were participants. They benefited from it. The cheap land their employers claimed had been taken from someone else. This is an uncomfortable truth that Western mythology usually ignores. Let me tell you about a specific cowboy to make this more concrete. His name was Nat Love, though he called himself Deadwood Dick. He was born enslaved in Tennessee in 1854. After emancipation, he headed west and became a cowboy. He worked cattle drives, competed in rodeos, and lived the full cowboy life. His autobiography, published in 1907, provides invaluable first-hand testimony about what cowboy life was actually like. Love describes the racism he faced, but also the opportunities the West provided. He writes about being respected for his skills with horses and ropes, even by white cowboys who would never socialize with him off the job. He describes the violence, the hardship, the camaraderie, and the sheer exhausting work. His story reminds us that black cowboys were not tokens or exceptions. They were integral to the cattle industry, doing the same dangerous work as everyone else. Mexican vaqueros bring another layer to this story. The entire cowboy culture emerged from Spanish and Mexican ranching traditions. When Americans began settling Texas, they encountered established cattle ranching operations run by Mexicans who had been there for generations. These vaqueros taught Anglo settlers everything they knew. The techniques for roping, the equipment, the vocabulary, all came from Mexican sources. But as Anglo settlement increased, Mexican vaqueros were pushed aside. They faced discrimination and violence. Their contributions were erased from the emerging cowboy mythology. By the late 19th century, Anglo cowboys were claiming they had invented techniques that Mexican vaqueros had been using for 100 years. This cultural theft and historical revision continues to shape how we understand the West. Women in the West also deserve mention because their experiences were dramatically different from the myths. Most women on the frontier were not prostitutes or dance hall girls. They were wives, mothers, and daughters trying to survive in harsh conditions. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, tended gardens, nursed the sick, and did countless other essential tasks. Ranch wives often worked cattle alongside men when necessary. They were tough, resourceful, and indispensable. A few women became cowboys themselves. They disguised themselves as men or worked on remote ranches where their gender was known but overlooked. These women could ride and rope as well as any man. Some became legendary in their own right, but they were rare exceptions in an overwhelmingly male occupation. The cowboy culture was aggressively masculine, and women who entered it had to be twice as tough to earn half the respect. Children on ranches grew up fast. Boys started working cattle by age 10 or 12. They learned to ride before they could read. Ranch life offered no childhood as we understand it. Children were small workers expected to contribute to family survival. Accidents were common. A boy could be trampled, gored, or thrown from a horse and crippled for life. Education was sparse to non-existent on remote ranches. Many cowboys were functionally illiterate. The isolation of ranch life created its own psychological challenges. Cowboys on remote ranches might go weeks without seeing anyone outside their small crew. They talked to the same few people every day. They saw the same landscape endlessly. Some men went mad from the isolation. They started talking to themselves, developing paranoid delusions, or simply giving up and walking away into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Mail was precious because it provided connection to the outside world. Letters from family back east were read and reread until they fell apart. Newspapers, even old ones, were treasured. Cowboys would read every word of a month-old newspaper multiple times just to have something different to think about. The hunger for news, for stories, for any glimpse of the wider world was intense and constant. Alcohol abuse was rampant for understandable reasons. Cowboys drank to forget the pain, the loneliness, the hopelessness of their situation. Some became alcoholics who could barely function. Others drank only when they got to town, but then drank to excess. The saloons profited from this desperation, selling rot-gut whiskey that destroyed men's health. Cowboys died from alcohol poisoning, from fights while drunk, from accidents caused by intoxication. Gambling was another escape and another trap. Cowboys played cards in bunkhouses, betting their meager wages on poker hands. Professional gamblers worked the cattle towns, fleecing drunk cowboys with rigged games and card tricks. A cowboy could lose months of pay in a single night. Some became addicted to gambling, unable to stop even as they destroyed themselves financially. The thrill of the game, the hope of winning big, these proved irresistible to men with few other pleasures. Music provided one of the few pure joys in cowboy life. Men brought harmonicas, fiddles, guitars to ranches and on trail drives. They played folk songs, hymns, popular tunes they remembered from childhood. The music created moments of beauty and connection in otherwise brutal lives. Cowboys who could play an instrument were valued members of any crew. Their music made the hardship more bearable. Storytelling served a similar function. Around campfires and in bunkhouses, cowboys told tales. They exaggerated their adventures, invented heroic versions of themselves, and passed along legends they'd heard from others. This oral tradition created the mythology of the cowboy, even while the real cowboys were still living. The stories grew wilder with each retelling. Men who were barely getting by became heroes in their own narratives. But beneath the stories was the grinding reality. Cowboys were aging fast. The work destroyed bodies. Men in their 30s often looked 50. They had bad backs, arthritic joints, chronic pain from old injuries. Many developed respiratory problems from years of breathing dust. Their teeth rotted from poor nutrition and lack of dental care. They faced a future without pensions, without savings, without job security. When they became too old or too injured to work, they were discarded. Some former cowboys became ranch foremen or trail bosses, leveraging experience into slightly better positions, but these jobs were few. Most cowboys faced a bleak future. They drifted into manual labor in towns, worked as janitors or stable hands, or ended up destitute. The old cowboy begging for drinks in a saloon or sleeping in alleys was a common sight by the 1890s. The West had used them up and thrown them away. Third, the end of an era, why the cowboy legend died and what replaced it. The beginning of the end came quietly, as most endings do. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but a series of changes that individually seemed small, but collectively destroyed the cowboy way of life. The year 1886 marked a turning point, though few recognized it at the time. A catastrophic winter swept across the Great Plains, killing hundreds of thousands of cattle and bankrupting ranchers across the West. But this disaster merely accelerated changes that were already underway. The open range was dying, and with it, the need for cowboys. Let me explain what killed the cowboy era, because understanding this reveals important truths about American history and capitalism. The first factor was the railroad itself. In the beginning, railroads created the cowboy by making it profitable to move Texas cattle north. But as rail lines spread deeper into Texas and across the West, the need for long cattle drives disappeared. Why drive cattle 1,000 miles to Kansas when a railroad depot was 50 miles away? The very technology that birthed the cowboy profession now made it obsolete. The second factor was barbed wire. This seems almost comically simple, but barbed wire changed everything. Before the 1870s, fencing the Great Plains was impossible. Wood was scarce. Stone walls were impractical. The open range existed because there was no practical way to enclose it. Cowboys moved cattle across unfenced grasslands that belonged to everyone and no one. But in 1874, Joseph Glidden patented an improved barbed wire design. Suddenly, cheap, effective fencing became possible. Ranchers and farmers began fencing land at a furious pace. They claimed water sources, blocked traditional cattle trails, and carved the open range into private parcels. Cowboys found their routes blocked by wire fences stretching for miles. Fence-cutting wars erupted as some cowboys and small ranchers fought back against the enclosures. They rode out at night and cut the wires, releasing cattle and opening the range again. But this was a losing battle. The law sided with property owners. Fence cutters were hunted down, arrested, sometimes shot. By the late 1880s, the open range had ceased to exist in most areas. What remained was privately owned ranch land, clearly marked and jealously guarded. Cowboys were no longer needed to drive cattle across open country because there was no open country left. They became ranch hands working on fenced properties, a completely different job requiring different skills. The romance of the trail drive, such as it was, disappeared into memory. The third factor was the terrible winter I mentioned earlier. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is remembered as the Great Die-Up. Ranchers, grown overconfident from years of mild weather and rising cattle prices, had overstocked the range. Too many cattle competing for too little grass. Then the weather turned apocalyptic. Blizzard after blizzard hammered the plains. Temperatures plunged to 40 and 50 degrees below zero. Snow drifted 15 and 20 feet deep. Cattle couldn't reach grass beneath the snow. They starved and froze by the hundreds of thousands. Cowboys tried desperately to save the herds. They rode through blinding snow, trying to move cattle to shelter that didn't exist. They watched helplessly as animals died around them. When spring finally came, the carnage was revealed. Dead cattle littered the landscape as far as the eye could see. Some ranchers lost 90% of their herds. Fortunes built over decades vanished in 4 months. The survivors learned a harsh lesson. You couldn't run cattle on open range and expect nature to cooperate. The old way was finished. After the Great Die-Up, Ranching became more scientific and controlled. Ranchers reduced herd sizes. They bought hay to feed cattle through winter. They built barns and shelters. They improved breeding to produce heartier animals. This required more capital, more infrastructure, more planning. It also required fewer cowboys. The work became less about driving cattle and more about maintaining property, and that work could be done by a smaller, more permanent workforce. The fourth factor was economic. The cattle boom of the 1870s and early 80s had attracted massive investment from Eastern and European capitalists. British and Scottish investors poured millions into Western ranches, expecting huge returns. For a while, the profits seemed limitless, but overproduction led to falling beef prices. The market became glutted. Investors who had expected 20% annual returns suddenly faced losses. Capital dried up. Ranches consolidated or went bankrupt. The wild speculation ended, taking many cowboy jobs with it. Simultaneously, farming was spreading across the plains. Homesteaders claimed land under various government acts. They plowed the grasslands and planted wheat. Cowboys and farmers were natural enemies. Farmers wanted to protect their crops from cattle. They built fences and demanded that ranchers control their herds. When cattle trampled fields, farmers shot them. When cowboys retaliated, violence erupted. The Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892 saw wealthy ranchers hiring gunmen to attack homesteaders they accused of cattle rustling. The army had to intervene to prevent massacre, but the farmers kept coming. They had the law on their side and the unstoppable momentum of agricultural expansion. The grasslands that had sustained buffalo and then cattle were transformed into farms. The cowboy culture that depended on open range couldn't survive this transformation. By 1900, the cowboy as a cultural type was already becoming a historical curiosity rather than a living reality. Technology delivered further blows. Refrigerated railroad cars meant cattle could be slaughtered near the ranches and shipped as dressed beef. This eliminated many of the stockyards and cattle towns that had employed cowboys. Windmills made it possible to pump water in areas without natural sources, changing where and how cattle could be raised. Trucks eventually replaced cattle drives entirely. Every technological advance made the traditional cowboy more obsolete. The mythology of the cowboy began, even as the reality was ending. Buffalo Bill Cody started his Wild West show in 1883, creating a theatrical version of frontier life for Eastern audiences. His shows featured trick riding, sharpshooting, staged battles between cowboys and Indians, and reenactments of famous events. It was pure entertainment, divorced from reality, but it shaped how Americans thought about the West. Real cowboys sometimes joined these shows, performing exaggerated versions of their former lives for paying crowds. Dime novels flooded the market with lurid tales of cowboy adventures. These cheap paperbacks sold millions of copies to readers hungry for Western excitement. They featured heroes who never existed performing deeds that never happened in places that were barely recognizable. The fictional cowboy was brave, noble, quick with a gun, and always victorious. He bore no resemblance to the underpaid, overworked young men actually herding cattle, but readers didn't care. They wanted myths, not truth. Artists like Frederick Remington and Charles Russell created powerful paintings and sculptures of cowboys and Western life. Their work captured real elements of frontier experience, but also romanticized and idealized it. A Remington painting shows a cowboy as a heroic figure, strong and free, battling nature and savagery. It doesn't show the dysentery, the poverty, the exploitation. Art created an image that outlived the reality. By the early 20th century, the cowboy existed primarily in imagination. Real ranch hands still worked cattle, but they used trucks and tractors. They lived in a modern world with telephones and eventually electricity. The old ways were gone, but the myth was just beginning its cultural dominance. The first Western films appeared in the 1910s. These silent movies presented the West as a place of adventure and moral clarity. Good cowboys fought bad outlaws. Justice always prevailed. The complexity and ambiguity of real history disappeared into simple narratives. Hollywood perfected the Western genre in the following decades. Stars like John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Clint Eastwood embodied the ideal cowboy. Tough, honorable, skilled with weapons, ready to defend the innocent. These films created a powerful national mythology. They told Americans that their country was built by brave individuals conquering wilderness. They erased the genocide of Native Americans, the exploitation of workers, the corporate greed, the environmental destruction. They turned a brief, ugly period of economic expansion into a foundation myth. The question we must ask is why this mythology proved so durable and powerful. Why do people still love cowboy stories when the reality was so different from the fantasy? Part of the answer is that the cowboy represents something Americans want to believe about themselves. The cowboy is independent, answering to no one. He lives by his own code. He solves problems with skill and courage. He's free in a way that modern life doesn't permit. But this is precisely backwards. Real cowboys were not independent. They were employees of large ranching corporations, doing what they were told for minimal pay. They had no freedom to choose their work, their hours, or their conditions. They were trapped by economic necessity and dangerous, degrading labor. The cowboy myth is popular because it lets Americans avoid confronting the reality of their economic system. It suggests that individuals can be free and self-sufficient, when the truth is that most people are dependent on wages and vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The cowboy myth also serves to justify the conquest of the West. If cowboys were heroes taming wilderness, then the destruction of native societies becomes a necessary step in progress rather than a crime. If the frontier was empty land waiting to be claimed, then the theft of that land from its original inhabitants seems legitimate. The mythology erases inconvenient truths and replaces them with a story that makes Americans feel good about their history. Let's talk about what happened to the real cowboys as their profession disappeared. Some adapted to changing times. They became ranch foremen, rodeo performers, or found other work. But many struggled. The skills that made a good cowboy were not transferable to factory work or urban employment. Men who could ride all day and rope a steer from horseback had no relevant experience for the industrial economy emerging in American cities. Rodeos emerged partly as a way for cowboys to monetize their skills after the trail drives ended. Competitive events like bronc riding, bull riding, and calf roping let cowboys earn prize money by demonstrating abilities that were no longer needed in daily work. The first organized rodeos appeared in the 1880s and 90s. They grew into major spectacles, drawing huge crowds, but only a few cowboys could make real money on the rodeo circuit. Most still needed regular jobs. Some cowboys moved to Hollywood and found work in westerns, either as stunt performers or technical advisors. They taught actors how to ride and handle ropes convincingly. They provided the authentic details that made films believable. But there was bitter irony in this. They were helping to create the myths that distorted the reality they had lived. They watched actors portray cowboys as glamorous heroes, while the real cowboys struggled to pay rent. Many former cowboys simply disappeared into the working class. They became laborers, farmhands, factory workers, anything that would pay. Their stories went unrecorded. They died in obscurity, forgotten by a nation that loved cowboys in theory, but ignored them in reality. No one built monuments to the men who actually drove cattle or lived the hard life. The monuments went to the fictional heroes instead. The transformation of the West continued relentlessly. The vast grasslands became farms and ranches divided by fences and roads. Towns grew into cities. Railroads gave way to highways. The wilderness that had seemed endless was mapped, claimed, and settled. By the middle of the 20th century, the Wild West existed only in movies and books. You could drive from Texas to Kansas on paved roads, passing through suburbs and shopping centers, and never see anything resembling the landscape cowboys had known. Native American communities survived but barely, confined to reservations, stripped of their lands, forbidden to practice their cultures. They endured poverty and oppression that continues today. The cowboy mythology celebrates the settlement of the West while erasing the genocide that made it possible. When we watch a Western film showing brave cowboys fighting savage Indians, we're watching propaganda that justifies historical crimes. The environmental cost of the cattle industry was enormous. Overgrazing damaged grasslands permanently. Erosion increased. Native plant species declined. The buffalo that had numbered in the tens of millions were reduced to a few hundred survivors by 1900. Their near extinction altered the entire ecosystem of the Great Plains. The cattle that replaced them required different management and caused different damage. The landscape itself was transformed by the industry that employed cowboys. Let me bring this back to individual human experience, because statistics and historical forces can obscure the personal tragedies. Imagine you're a cowboy in 1895. You're 35 years old. You've worked cattle for 15 years. Your body is breaking down. Your back hurts constantly. You can barely walk some mornings. You have no savings because you never earned enough to save. The ranches are hiring fewer cowboys and paying less. The long drives don't happen anymore. You have few options. You can try to stay in ranching, accepting lower wages and harder conditions. You can head to a city and compete for factory jobs with thousands of other men. You can drift from place to place, taking day labor when you can find it. Or you can give up, turn to drink and fade away. Many cowboys faced exactly this choice, and many chose the last option. They died young, forgotten, and poor, their contributions unrecognized. Now consider the broader historical context. The cowboy era, from roughly 1866 to 1890, lasted barely 25 years, a single generation. In the vast sweep of American history, it's a brief moment. Yet it has dominated American cultural imagination for over a century. Why does this short period carry such weight? Because it coincided with the period when America was transforming from an agricultural nation to an industrial power. The cowboy represented the old way of life, the independence and freedom that industrialization was destroying. Americans felt nostalgic for this imagined freedom, even while they were building the industrial economy that made real freedom impossible for most workers. The cowboy became a symbol of what was being lost, even though the real cowboys had never possessed the freedom they supposedly represented. The mythology served emotional needs that reality couldn't satisfy. It still does. Today, the cowboy image is everywhere. Clothing brands sell cowboy boots and hats to people who will never ride a horse. Country music celebrates a rural lifestyle that barely exists. Politicians invoke cowboy values of independence and self-reliance while supporting corporate interests. The cowboy has become pure symbol, completely detached from historical reality. You can love cowboys without knowing anything true about them. But knowing the truth matters. The real cowboys were working men exploited by a capitalist system that valued profit over human welfare. They endured terrible conditions for poverty wages. They were diverse in ethnicity and background. They participated in the dispossession of Native Americans. They lived hard, died young, and were forgotten. Understanding this doesn't make them less interesting. It makes them more human, more real, more worthy of genuine respect rather than mythological worship. The death of the cowboy era teaches us about how quickly ways of life can change. The forces of technology, capitalism, and demographic change transformed the West in a single generation. The cowboys couldn't stop these changes. They were swept aside by economic forces beyond their control. This pattern has repeated throughout American history. Industries rise and fall, jobs disappear, workers are discarded. The cowboy story is, in this sense, very modern. It's about economic disruption and the human cost of progress. What replaced the cowboy was the ranch hand, a different type of worker for a different type of ranching. Modern ranch work involves machinery, scientific management, and permanent employment. It's a job, not an adventure. The romance is gone, assuming it was ever there. But the work continues because people still eat beef and cattle still need tending. The difference is that nobody makes movies about modern ranch hands. They lack the mythological power of the cowboy. The cowboy legacy is complicated and contradictory. On one hand, real cowboys were ordinary workers doing hard jobs. On the other hand, the cowboy myth has shaped American identity profoundly. We can acknowledge both truths. We can study the history honestly while recognizing the power of the mythology. We can appreciate Western films while knowing they're fiction. We can honor the real cowboys by telling their true stories instead of perpetuating comfortable lies. In the end, the cowboy era was a brief explosion of a specific type of labor driven by particular economic conditions. When those conditions changed, the cowboy disappeared. What remained was the myth, powerful and enduring, shaping how Americans see themselves and their history. The myth will probably outlast any memory of the reality. But for those willing to look past the Hollywood version, the real story is richer, stranger, and more human than any legend. And so we've discovered the truth about cowboys, a truth far more compelling than Hollywood's fantasies. These weren't legendary heroes. They were young men trapped in brutal labor, used up by an economic system that valued profits over people. Their diversity, their struggles, their suffering and survival, these deserve our respect more than any myth. The real Wild West was harder, stranger, and more human than we imagined. What other historical legends should we challenge next? If you enjoyed this journey beyond the myths, hit that like button and subscribe to the History Uncovered. Turn on notifications for more historical truth. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.